Thank you for coming and thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. I'd like you to imagine for a moment that you're someplace safe and you have a good view off into the distance. And in the distance you can see a wall or a boundary or a border of some kind. And just over this wall you can see hundreds of people and they're running towards the wall. Soon they're at the wall and they're rushing over it. And they're rushing over it in desperation and fear. They're running from something. What is your first concern? What is it that you're thinking about in that scenario? Go ahead, raise your hand. What's coming at you? What are they running from? That's what I would be concerned with as well. Right now, our conversation on the U.S. Mexico border and on immigration policy is not asking this fundamental question on any serious level. Why are hundreds of thousands of people leaving their homes, leaving their families, and risking their lives crossing an inhospitable desert to come to the United States? Why? Instead, what we're focused on is deterrence, prevention. We're focused on the wall. We're focused on building it higher, investing more border patrol, more surveillance, more miles of walls. How is it that we've gotten here? Why is it that that's the approach that we're taking to one of the biggest migrations in human history? It has to do with the criminalization of migrants. Unfortunately, we've come to confuse migrants with criminals. And it's very sad, especially given that we're a country comprised mainly of immigrants and the families and the sons and daughters and ancestors of immigrants. What I'd like to do today is reframe this movement of people, reframe this migration in terms of human rights, in terms of the humanity of migrants. What this allows us to do is look at migration on the collective level. It's a lot easier to look at migrants as criminals when you look at them on the individual level. When you look at this choice to cross a border, you see a law, you see a lawbreaker. It's a lot easier to oversimplify the issue. When we look at it on the collective level, like the scenario with the wall, hundreds of people rushing toward it, our vision becomes a little bit more complicated, and I think that the truth is revealed. Well, that goes fast. When I'm talking about human rights is basically the golden rule. I'm talking about the philosophical orientation upon which human rights law was built. And I think that this Article 1 quote from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights sums it up very well. All human beings are born with equal and inalienable rights and fundamental freedoms. Help promote and defend them for yourself as well as for your fellow human beings. It's essentially the golden rule, to do unto others what you would want done unto yourself. A human rights approach, an approach to the collective, an approach to the humanity of migrants is desperately needed on the U.S. Mexico border. Without it, what we end up with is deadly. This is what our border looks like when we don't have an approach that centers the humanity of migrants. This is a map of southern Arizona, and each red dot represents a location where a body was found, a location where the remains of a migrant were discovered, where someone lost their life in the desert in an attempt to build a better life for their family. This is just in southern Arizona. This map represents just over 2,000 deaths in southern Arizona, and there are more across the entire U.S. Mexico border. Our border wasn't always this way. This data is from the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner, compiled by the Binational Migration Institute. From 1990 to 1999, the average number of recovered remains in southern Arizona was 12. From 2000 through 2013, that average jumped more than tenfold to 165 every single year, an average of 165 every year. What happened? What happened right there to affect such a drastic tenfold increase in loss of life on the border? What happened was an approach to the border focused on prevention and deterrence, rather than on the human rights, the humanity, and the question, what is pushing people across this border? And in fact, the Border Patrol policy, 1994 strategic plan, the philosophical orientation was titled Prevention Through Deterrence. The idea was that people would be deterred once they got to the border and they saw how dangerous and how difficult it would be to cross the border. In 1994, it was passed. It went into effect right around 2000, 2001 in southern Arizona, which is why we see this drastic increase in the number of deaths. The strategy was essentially to build up Border Patrol presence in the urban, kind of traditional, more or less safe points of crossing, like San Diego, Nogales, El Paso. And what was left open were the wide expanses of desert, sea, mountainous, very, very remote terrain. Doris Meisner, then chief of the INS under Bill Clinton, has been quoted in 2005 as saying that they expected that they could use geography as an ally, that people would basically realize how risky it would be to cross and that they wouldn't attempt, and that migration would go down to a trickle once people were faced with the desert. Well, we know now that they didn't. Hundreds of thousands of people went through, and thousands of them died. 6,000 people have died along the U.S. Mexico border. To put that number in perspective, the U.S. Mexico border has been more than 40 times more deadly than the Berlin Wall in its entire existence. When we're talking about border deaths and the death toll of the U.S. Mexico border, we're talking about human remains found on the U.S. side. So when we're talking about border security, we're talking about this cost effect. And one of the costs is 6,000 remains found in the last decade. And these are only the bodies that have been found. And the number of 6,000 over the last decade comes from Border Patrol. And Border Patrol are not involved in all of the recoveries of remains found along the U.S.-Mexico border. So we have many reasons to believe that this count is actually incomplete. But if you take that 6,000 number and you look at it in terms of other mass fatality events that have happened in the United States, the death toll from the U.S.-Mexico border has been more than that of 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina combined. What we're seeing on the U.S.-Mexico border is a silent mass disaster that continues. Not only does it continues every single year. 165 deaths, again, this is just the Arizona number per year on average. That's the equivalent of a medium-sized plane crash every single year for more than 10 years on end. What if, instead of focusing on prevention, instead of focusing on deterrence, what if we knew that people will always migrate? Migration is as old as human history. We are all migrants, or the ancestors of migrants. What if, instead of focusing on prevention, we asked instead, how are we going to treat them? They're going to come no matter what. They're going to walk through a desert for a week. They're going to risk their lives. They're going to scale a wall because there are very serious things compelling them to do so. People have moved, people have migrated for hundreds of years for three key reasons: economics, violence, and family separation. Until these structural, sociological level factors are addressed, people are going to come. We're not going to stop them with walls. We're only going to hurt them. This is Carmen. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Carmen. He's from the southern state of Guerrero in Mexico. He's one of 8 brothers. And Carmen comes from a long line of corn farmers. His family has tilled a very small little plot of land in Guerrero for many, many years. Times had always been rough, pretty much as long as the family could remember. It was always tough to make ends meet. But something drastic happened right around the early 2000s. Carmen's family was no longer able to compete to sell their corn and their beans at market. They would go to the market and they, throughout the year, were not able to cut enough of a profit to be able to buy seeds for the next year. How many of you have heard of NAFTA? North American Free Trade Agreement. Well, you guys are very informed. This is another thing that we don't hear about very often. We don't hear about NAFTA very often. Right now is the 20-year anniversary of NAFTA. It was signed in 1994, the same year that the Border Patrol Strategic Plan went into effect. So we're hearing about it a little bit more now. But in general, we're not hearing about NAFTA when we're talking about immigration reform. And it's one of the key factors pushing people off of their land and up into the dangerous migration corridors that end for many people in the desert. Carmen's family is one of millions. And a very direct result of NAFTA was that 1.1 million farmers were pushed off of their land. Another 4 million over the last 20 years have lost their jobs and migrated north as a direct result of NAFTA. What NAFTA essentially did is that it removed trade barriers to very, very large companies so that large companies could basically go into places like Carmen's hometown and sell their corn at supermarkets for way more cheaply than Carmen's family could afford to sell them at the market. So Carmen's family was broke. They weren't making ends meet at all at this point. They decided that the very best hope for them was to leave their hometown and migrate north. They heard that they could get jobs in agriculture, something that they were familiar with in the United States. Carmen, the youngest, stayed behind. His parents were quite old and they were ill. So Carmen's 7 brothers and their wives and Carmen's wife migrated up to North Carolina, where they began work on the fields. A couple of months later, Carmen's parents finally passed away, and he followed in his brother's footsteps up through Mexico to Altar, Sonora, which is south of where we are today, and crossed into the Arizona portion of the Sonoran Desert. About a month later, his body was found. And it was found so decomposed that it took several months for the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner to finally identify him. In the meantime, his first child was born, a little girl, a U.S. citizen. I'd like you to think about the last kind of post-apocalyptic disaster movie that you've seen. This is a really common genre. Maybe I'm the only one that ends up seeing a lot of these. But think about these types of movies where you have the protagonist trying to survive in a very inhospitable climate. Disaster has struck. People are out looking for food and shelter and safety. This is the reality for many Central Americans and Mexicans today. They're already facing a post-apocalyptic future. In that scenario, what would you do for your family? What would you do to survive? I think that's how we need to start thinking about why people are leaving their families. People don't want to leave their families and their homes to walk through a desert and risk their lives to come here. Manuel left for reasons relating to violence. He left his home in Honduras because he'd been working for a drug cartel. He was recruited to work for the drug cartel when he was quite young, about 15 years old. And he eventually decided that he didn't like the work that he was doing. He was afraid. He didn't feel good about it. He wasn't making very much money. He was basically terrified. He told the people at the cartel that he wanted to leave, and actually leaving your work at a drug cartel is a lot easier said than done. They threatened his life, and they threatened the life of his sister. So he left. He and his sister left, and they migrated through Mexico atop trains. You can see a photograph over there of the trains that migrants ride atop, but also a deadly part of their journey. And they made it all the way up to Altar, all the way up to southern Arizona. And eventually, Manuel's sister actually sprained her ankle on the way, and she wasn't able to keep up with the group. He stayed behind with her, but she succumbed to the elements and died in his arms. He's still looking for her body because he had to leave her behind so that he wouldn't die too. This is Estella. She's holding her son. She's pictured with some other family members. Estella migrated for reasons relating to family. Estella had migrated to the United States several years prior. She'd migrated so that she could get a good job and support her child, who was being raised by her parents in Veracruz. He was being raised by his grandparents. But after several years in the United States without him, she decided that she couldn't take it anymore. She missed him too much. So she saved up the money and she went all the way back to Veracruz to retrieve her son. And they went all the way back up, the same place, Altar, Sonora, got ready, and the next day crossed into southern Arizona. Not very long into their journey, I think it was actually the first or the second day, Estella started to suffer the effects of heat stroke. Pretty soon she passed out, and she had to be left behind. The group had to pull her son away from her when they left her behind. He was 5 years old. He told me that he'd left his jacket on her body when they left her behind. How many of you are parents? I hope to be one day. Can you remember a time when you lost track of your child, even just for a few minutes, maybe in a crowded place? If you can think about the fear, the terror that you feel in that moment, the flood of scenarios of possibly what could be happening right now, where is your kid, and are they in danger? This is what the families of the missing are going through every day for years, It's very difficult to move on. Anthropologically speaking, it's impossible to mourn the loss of a loved one without a body. Right now, the Colibrí Center for Human Rights has records for more than 2,000 missing people. Our border is not only killing people, but people are disappearing. These families are stuck in time. They can't go on. Imagine trying to go on when you know that every single day you're trying to lead a normal life. Your loved one could be suffering, could be out there somewhere needing your help, looking for you. The missing wake their loved ones up in dreams and tell them, I'm thirsty, I need your help, I'm lost, I'm scared. Some of the family members that we've spoken to at Colibri say that they only feel alive when they're searching for their loved one. Some of them have attempted suicide. Some of them have died from health complications. This is a serious psychological and social issue. And in this context, the families are actually hindered in their process to search because they're perpetually on the wrong side of the border. They're from Mexico or they're from Central America, and the remains, if their loved one did pass away, are in Arizona. So connecting all of the data and all of the bureaucracy is incredible. It's like an endless phone tree constantly, and their searching just becomes part of their trauma. This is why the Colibrí Center for Human Rights exists. Colibrí means hummingbird in Spanish. In 2009, the remains of a man, a migrant, were found in southern Arizona, not far from Tucson. And in his pocket, he carried a small, dead hummingbird. Hummingbirds represent a very powerful symbol to Mexican and Central American cultures. It represents a messenger between the living and the dead. People say if you see a hummingbird, someone is trying to tell you something from the other side. We named the Colibrí Center for Human Rights for this man and for the spirit of the hummingbird because we honor the idea of being a messenger, not only to the families who are desperate for information so that they can heal and move on, but from the dead to the rest of the world, that our border has to change. This can't be acceptable to all of us. I know none of us want a border like this. What can you do? You can help. There are things we can do. We can all rehumanize. We can encourage our friends and family to stop using the word illegal, to stop subtly criminalizing these people. These are immigrants. They're risking their lives for a reason. We can call our representatives and we can encourage that human rights become a part of the conversation on the border. Just a part of the conversation. The fact that hundreds of people are dying every single year. Whenever we're talking about immigration, we have to be talking about the loss of life on the border following our border policies. Otherwise, they're not secure. This is not border security if we're not talking about the loss of life of hundreds of people. Finally, be a colibri. Be a messenger. Take what you've heard here today and tell others. Help us with our work. Visit us at thecolibrícenter.org. Thank you.